Solomon Islands, Pacific Theater. A humid dawn mist clings to the water like smoke from a dying fire. High above it, twin Allison engines roar in a desperate climb, the distinct twin-boom silhouette of a P-38 Lightning carving through the sky. Inside the cramped cockpit, a young American pilot fights his own aircraft as much as the enemy behind him. His hands strain against the control wheel. The nose refuses to rise. The aircraft shudders. Every movement feels sluggish, delayed, wrong. A Zero flashes past, elegant, tight-turning, almost mocking. Its cannon shells punch holes down the Lightning's right boom. Another burst slices across the canopy frame. The pilot curses through clenched teeth, yanking, wrestling, begging the machine to respond. It doesn't. The Lightning rolls into a steep dive, its speed increasing, but control slipping even further. The pilot has no choice. He disengages, defeated again. On the ground, Japanese mechanics would later joke. Large plane, heavy plane, cannot turn, good for target practice. But soon they would stop laughing. Because a handful of mechanics, using simple wires and stubborn creativity, were about to rewrite the P-38's fate. And that change begins with context, how the war forced innovation. When war exploded across the Pacific in late 1941, American pilots faced a problem larger than they ever anticipated: the Mitsubishi Zero. Fast, light, agile, it owned the skis from Pearl Harbor to the Philippines. U.S. aircraft, built heavier and built for range, struggled to match the Zero's turn rate and climb performance. Japan had invested years into pairing skilled aviators with a fighter designed around maneuver. American pilots were shocked not only by the Zero's abilities, but by how confidently its pilots used them. Dogfights became unforgiving lessons. Split-second errors meant sudden explosions of fuel and aluminum. The United States needed a fighter that could survive the long distances of the Pacific. That requirement pointed to one machine, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. A radical design. Twin engines, twin booms. A centralized cockpit pod like a predatory spear tip. It could fly faster and farther than almost anything in the U.S. arsenal. On paper, the P-38 was a game changer, the aircraft that could take the war directly back to Japan. But early reality in the Pacific was harsh. Pilots quickly recognized the Lightning wasn't behaving as expected in close combat. At high speeds, the very environment where American tactics demanded performance, the elevators tightened, controls stiffened, and response became delayed. At the edge of a dogfight, fractions of a second matter. The P-38 hesitated. The Zero never did. The Japanese noticed these weaknesses almost immediately. They learned that forcing the Lightning into a turning fight meant watching it bleed energy and then controlling the kill at leisure. The Zero could simply slip inside the P-38's wide turn radius and strike. American pilots started calling it the moment of helplessness, when they pulled back on the stick and the aircraft gave them nothing. Reports flowed up the chain of command. Cannot outturn, cannot pull tight angles at speed. Control compression, extremely dangerous. Yet the Lightning had strengths the Zero feared. It could dive hard and fast. Its firepower was unmatched, 4.50 cal machine guns and a 20mm cannon all centered in the nose. It could take damage and still fly. It carried range into the deep Pacific. But strengths unused are no strengths at all. To commanders, the frustration was infuriating. The P-38 had the right shape for victory, but the wrong responses under pressure. Every day the war continued, the urgency increased. Mechanics tackled maintenance. Pilots adapted tactics. Engineers drafted improvement proposals. Still, the Zero's reputation grew. Veterans called it impossible to chase and suicidal to corner. Rumors even spread among ground crews that the enemy machines were made of some secret lightweight metal unknown to Americans. Morale hung in the balance. If air superiority was lost, the Pacific War effort would bleed slowly and painfully. Then came the turning suggestion. Not from a high-ranking engineer, not from a professor in aerodynamics, but from the field, from those who had to fix these machines under scorching sun and constant threat of attack. Somewhere along a jungle runway, surrounded by makeshift shelters and stripped-down planes, a mechanic took a length of wire and pulled tension into the P-38's control system where factory settings allowed slack. It was not a formal modification. It was intuition, mechanical instinct, and desperation combined. Small adjustments, tiny corrections, barely noticeable unless you knew where to look. But when pilots stepped back into the sky, something felt different. The nose came up faster. Control surfaces responded sharper. The lightning began to turn, not like a zero, but like itself finally awakened. This was not yet the final solution, but it proved something extraordinary. The P-38 didn't need to become a Japanese fighter to beat Japanese fighters. It only needed the best version of what it already could be. Hope returned, carried by steel cables, tightened spool by spool. Because from that moment forward, experimentation accelerated, and confidence followed. The first successes hinted at a larger truth. A single clever idea can shift the balance of an entire theater. And that balance is about to tilt more sharply as we continue the deeper context. Long before the Pacific exposed its flaws, the P-38 Lightning had been envisioned as a high-altitude interceptor. It was built to chase bombers in the European sky, not Japanese fighters over steaming island jungles. But war does not wait for ideal conditions. It punishes what is unprepared. Combat squadrons across the Pacific reported the same issues. At high speeds, the tails seemed to lock up. Pilots fought the controls instead of the enemy. Engineers understood why the aircraft's aerodynamic surfaces experienced compression effects near transonic speeds, a phenomenon barely studied before the war. The controls stiffened to the edge of failure. The Zero turned this into its advantage. Japanese pilots trained in aggressive maneuver tactics. They believed the close-range turning fight was honorable and deadly. The Zero was built around that philosophy: lightweight construction, minimal armor, paper-thin skin. It turned beautifully, but one solid hit could tear it apart. American pilots knew that. They also knew they rarely got the chance to deliver that hit. But the Pacific War had a unique advantage. Distance. Fighters often flew hundreds of miles to reach combat zones. The P-38's twin engines gave reliability. If one failed, the other brought a pilot home. Survivability was not theoretical. Pilots witnessed it every day in forced landings on coral strips under fire. The aircraft had potential. It only needed the right control. That was when small changes, improvised, unapproved, but brilliant, began creeping into P-38s across island bases. Mechanics tightened cable tensions in the elevator system. Some added pushrods with little more than basic tools and stubborn resolve. Others inserted spacer blocks or stiffened surfaces to lessen flex at high G-loads. None of these modifications came from Lockheed's headquarters. They came from sweaty, exhausted hands working under lantern light. Pilots immediately felt it. Instead of lagging behind stick movements, the aircraft responded with new eagerness. Instead of groaning under pressure, it came alive. But improvements required proof, not just pilot confidence. The upcoming battles would supply it. While these changes spread, engineers back home accelerated factory-level redesigns. Locked-in trim tabs were updated. Boosted ailerons and revised tail controls entered production. The Lightning evolved quickly. Japan, meanwhile, celebrated early victories with pride. Newspapers boasted of invincible Zero fighters. Pilots believed they faced machines too clumsy to ever pose real threat. And the P-38 did still lose battles at first. But every loss came with knowledge. Every damaged plane returned with data. Every mechanic learned exactly where the metal had bent under air pressure. Innovation wasn't happening in a laboratory. It was happening in muddy revetments, fueled by urgency, fear, and the raw necessity of staying alive. Eventually, the lightning would no longer dive to escape, it would dive to attack. It would no longer avoid confrontation, it would dictate the fight. The Pacific began to feel a shift, something quiet, something growing. Japan was still laughing. But the US was tightening wires, tuning control systems, and preparing a lesson that would soon echo across the skies. Technology alone does not win wars. Adaptation does. And the first pilots to test the fully improved P-38s were about to reveal the results in combat. The next stage of this story isn't about machines alone. It's about the people who fought inside them and those determined to help them survive. No pilot forgets the first time he sees tracers reach past his canopy. During the early Pacific campaigns, P-38 pilots lived in a constant cycle of uncertainty. Will the aircraft respond in time? Will the enemy get inside the turn again? They trained hard, but training could not erase hesitation. Every missed shot meant another Zero slipping away. Every steep bank risked losing control authority at the worst moment. Letters home carried the weight of these fears. We have the firepower, but she just won't turn when you need her to. If only she would follow my hands. Yet pilots believed in the lightning. They saw its strengths, speed, and survivability and clung to them like lifelines. They took risks, experimenting with energy tactics, learning to dive away, strike fast, and disengage. Then the modifications came. The first pilots who flew with tightened control systems landed with wide eyes. Their words spread faster than official memos. She listens now. You pull, she comes. Fear did not vanish. War doesn't allow that. But confidence returned, and with it, the will to push harder. Few get glory in war like the ones who fly. But beneath every takeoff lies the labor of those who don't. Pacific mechanics worked in brutal environments, heat that melted tools to palms, storms that flooded revetments, insects that swarmed amid fuel fumes. Replacement parts took weeks to arrive. Often they never came. So they improvised. They tightened every cable the aircraft allowed. They inspected control rods for even the slightest flex. They rigged elevator trim with small tweaks that created massive changes in maneuver response. Sometimes a mechanic would stand back, wipe the sweat off his neck, and say, "Try it now, sir." These were not lucky guesses. These were experts watching how stress bent their aircraft, listening to pilot feedback, understanding danger more intimately than any blueprint designer. The wire fix did not arrive in a perfect manual. It grew from hundreds of hands pursuing survival through ingenuity. Mechanics seldom fired guns in combat, but their contributions shot Zeros from the sky all the same. Back in the United States, the reports troubled engineers. This wasn't a minor issue, it was a critical flaw. If the P-38 failed, long-range fighter capability in the Pacific would collapse. What came next was one of the fastest adaptation cycles seen in WWAI aviation. New control surface designs, revised trim tab geometry, boosted aileron systems for faster roll at speed, tail reinforcement for stability near compressibility. Simultaneously, commanders in theater refined tactics. Boom and zoom strikes. Altitude advantage as a weapon. Offensive diving attacks instead of turning fights. Escort doctrine to protect bombers from zero harassment. They aligned technology and tactics together, finally playing to the Lightning's strengths rather than forcing incompatible maneuvers. The aircraft was no longer a misunderstood interceptor. It was on the path to become the Pacific's long-range predator. Japanese intelligence examined captured P-38 wrecks and underestimated what they saw. To them it was too big, too heavy, too sluggish. Pilots mocked its early failures, a giant bird flapping against a swift hawk. They believed range advantage meant little if maneuverability still decided battles. But slowly, Japanese pilots noticed something alarming. The Lightning was surviving more. It was diving faster. It was returning to the fight instead of fleeing. New tactics confused their expectations. What once looked like weakness, diving away, became the American method of attack. Before long, Japanese commanders saw bomber raids reach deeper and fighters lingering longer. This was not the same enemy aircraft they had first mocked. Japan had miscalculated. They thought they were fighting a static machine. Instead, they were fighting evolution. The next angle reveals how this evolution translated into decisive combat advantage, and how the skis of the Pacific suddenly felt different when lightning struck. Once the P-38's handling sharpened, pilots began rewriting the rules of engagement. No more chasing Zeros in tight spirals. No more predictable defensive dives. Instead, they embraced energy warfare, altitude, speed, and sudden violence. Typical combat shift. Climb well above enemy formations. Dive at extreme speed into the engagement. Fire a single deadly pass using nose-mounted guns. Extend out of range before the Zero could respond. This was not cowardice, it was physics used as a weapon. For the first time, US pilots controlled the tempo. Zeros tried to follow dives and lost structural integrity or oversped their engines. If they attempted to climb, the Lightning simply outran them into the sky. It became a predatory cycle. Strike. Withdraw. Strike again. Tactics that once felt desperate now felt professional, designed for victory. War is fought with metal, but won with morale. When the P-38 struggled, pilots mentally braced for disadvantage before every mission. A Zero sighting meant survival instinct surged, not confidence. Once the upgrades took hold, everything changed. Pilots reported a new sensation. Control. Squadrons began to write mission tallies proudly onto engine cowlings. They talked about Lightning as a force to respect and fear. Japan's aura of aerial invincibility began to crack. Every Zero downed by a P-38 was more than a tactical win, it was a psychological demolition. In mess tents, laughter returned. In the air, aggression replaced hesitation. The Lightning was no longer a target. It was the hunter. This transformation didn't belong to one genius or one idea. It belonged to a network of minds spread across an ocean. Pilots describing control compression in vivid detail. Mechanics translating words into mechanical fixes. Engineers redesigning systems based on frontline feedback. Commanders trusting field innovation instead of shutting it down. This was a war where communication became survival. And the US military, unlike Japan, excelled at scalable adaptation. While Japanese manufacturing stagnated, American logistics surged. Modified P-38s multiplied. Every squadron gained improvements. The change that began with one mechanic's intuition became standardized doctrine. Innovation had spread like electricity through the Pacific. The Zero was a marvel when introduced. But war accelerates faster than design can follow. Japan's industrial limitations meant upgrades were slow. Resources were stretched thin. Fuel quality worsened. Veteran pilots, irreplaceable assets, were lost faster than they could be trained. The Zero's early edge shrank. It had no armor to protect inexperienced pilots. No self-sealing fuel tanks to stop fires. No structural allowance to match diving speeds. Against a rapidly evolving P-38, the Zero was now forced to fight outside its ideal arena. Its proud reputation became a burden, one that pilots bore with increasing despair. Japanese aviation doctrine had celebrated superiority, but had not prepared for change. The skis transformed from a stage of dominance to a minefield of danger. For the Zero, the countdown to obsolescence had begun. The Lightning now held advantages once unimaginable. But the true test of transformation would come not through theory, but through fire. Next, we enter the decisive battles, the moment when Japan realized the joke was over. The stage was set in 1943. American forces had clawed their way into reach of key Japanese strongholds. The P-38 Lightning, once mocked, was now the spear leading long-range combat in the Pacific. Outpost airstrips carved from coral and jungle gave birth to missions that stretched the limits of pilots and machines. Bombers needed escorts, naval movements needed eyes, and every Zero that rose in response posed a test. Had the Lightning truly become lethal? The answer came fast. Vast skis above the Owen Stanley Mountains became a proving ground. P-38s climbed high, unseen by Japanese patrols below. Zero formations rose confidently to intercept. But instead of twisting into a turn, the Lightning's dove, soaring at speeds the Zero dared not chase. Nose guns concentrated fire into a tight, brutal stream. One pass, and a Zero spiraled downward, trailing flame. Pilots who once braced for survival now tasted victory. They regrouped in altitude, reattacked, and disengaged before Japan could recover momentum. Radio calls carried disbelief. They can't follow the dive. They're breaking away. American formation discipline, once a weakness, became a deadly pattern. In the Solomons, a Zero squadron spotted what they assumed was another lumbering Lightning patrol. They attacked in their usual confident manner, close, aggressive, forcing a turning contest. But the P-38s no longer allowed that. They climbed above, held nerve, then pounced as a synchronized unit. A Zero leader tried to roll away, the Lightning matched it. A wingman attempted a tight spiral. The Lightning refused the trap and slashed diagonally with superior energy. This time, the American pilots pulled back on the stick. And the aircraft obeyed. Zeros began falling faster than Japanese commanders could redirect the fight. The balance in the air was visibly shifting. The Zero had been designed for turn superiority at a cost. Minimal armor meant that a single lightning burst could shred control surfaces or ignite fuel instantly. The concentrated nose mounting compressed destruction into a single pinpoint stream. Where Zero wing-mounted guns scattered their aim, the P-38 delivered precision. Pilots described it like lightning striking a tree, a sudden crack of impact, then immediate break. Japanese aviators, long celebrated for elite training, now faced a foe that erased their advantage with physics. Speed, altitude, survivability, every factor had turned. American squadrons returned from missions with bombers intact. Recon aircraft reached targets and came home with photographs instead of obituaries. Pilots stood taller during debriefings, knowing they had saved lives beyond their own. One squadron intelligence officer wrote in late 1943. The Japanese no longer dictate the fight, the lightning does. Japan noticed. Communiques began urging pilots to avoid diving engagements. Warnings spread about the P-38's improved role and climb response. Stories circulated of entire formations broken apart in minutes. The fear had begun not for the Americans, but for the Japanese. The transformation of a single fighter aircraft was now reshaping Pacific air strategy. Victory was no longer theoretical, it was measurable. And it was about to be proven in a mission so bold, so precise, that it would enter the history books as one of WWII's most decisive aerial operations. A mission where the P-38 did the impossible: track, intercept, and eliminate a moving target of legendary significance. The next moment is not just combat. It is the instant when Japan understood lightning could strike anywhere. October 1943, the Solomon Islands. A formation of 16 P-38s climbs over the Emerald Peaks at dawn. Mist drapes the mountainsides, hiding the approaching predator. Below, Japanese reconnaissance reports indicate a small convoy, lightly defended, moving along the coastline. The pilots know their aircraft intimately now. They've felt the wire fixes, the control tweaks, the refined ailerons responding with instinctive precision. Their fingers rest lightly on the stick, no longer wrestling the plane, but commanding it. A pair of Zeros rises to intercept, confident in their turning superiority. The P-38 flight leader signals a classic boom and zoom attack. They dive from altitude, gaining speed with a roar that shakes the canopy. The Zeros turn tightly to follow and immediately fail to match the lightning's acceleration. 4 Zeros explode in flames before they can react. The American pilots climb back to regain altitude. Not a single lightning is hit. A veteran Japanese pilot later recalled in a debrief. "We thought the big plane would bend and break under our turns, but it climbed like a hawk and struck like lightning." The balance of power is clear. The P-38s are no longer prey, they are hunters. As the squadron sweeps toward the conv, they employ tactics honed through months of adaptation. Dive attacks from altitude. Concentrated fire from nose-mounted guns. Immediate withdrawal to preserve energy and avoid prolonged turning fights. Each pass is calculated, each burst of fire is lethal. Japanese destroyers and supply ships are caught by surprise. Anti-aircraft fire splashes harmlessly below. Pilots note the efficiency. Better than bombing runs, it's surgical. Mechanics on the ground who made the wire fix possible will never see this, yet every tightened cable contributes to each decisive maneuver. Reports from Japanese command are frantic. The Zeros, once supreme, are now losing encounters they once dominated. Pilots are forced into defensive dives they are ill-equipped to survive. Fuel shortages limit their ability to sustain altitude. The P-38s exploit these weaknesses ruthlessly. By the end of the day, the Pacific sky feels different. For the first time, Japanese pilots begin to fear the American fighter, not out of respect for numbers, but for innovation. A captured operational report would later state, "Lightning aircraft now demonstrate superior tactical flexibility and firepower. Close-range interception is no longer guaranteed." The realization is chilling. Japan had underestimated a single change, a small mechanical tweak that shifted the aerial war entirely. Aircrew return to jungle airstrips exhausted but victorious. Logs show multiple Zeros destroyed, enemy supply vessels incapacitated, and no American losses. The ratio of victory to defeat, once disheartening, is now inverted. The pilots' confidence is palpable. They no longer fly missions in fear. The wire fix and subsequent field modifications have transformed the P-38 from a clumsy giant into a lethal predator. From the front lines, letters home capture the sentiment. We finally control the fight. The Zeros can't escape. We are no longer the hunted. This day, repeated across similar engagements in the Solomons, marks the turning point in the Pacific Air War. The P-38, once mocked, now commands respect. It is the embodiment of adaptation, ingenuity, and human determination. By late 1943, the Pacific Air War had begun to tilt decisively. The P-38 Lightning's mechanical refinements and aggressive employment of boom and zoom tactics were no longer experimental. They were doctrine. Pilots flew with new confidence, mechanics refined aircraft faster, and commanders revised strategies to exploit every advantage. The first measurable impact was immediate. Loss ratios reversed. Early in the war, U.S. forces struggled to maintain parity with the agile Zeros. By late 1943, combat reports consistently showed favorable kill-to-loss ratios for the Americans. In one documented engagement over Bougainville, 6 P-38s downed 11 Zeros with no losses, a feat previously unimaginable. Tactical manuals began reflecting hardened lessons. The concept of energy management, altitude and speed as weapons became central to training. Dive attacks replaced turning duels. Escort formations were redesigned, using the P-38's range and firepower to shield bombers over hostile waters. Commanders observed a growing morale effect. Pilots no longer approached missions with dread, they approached them with purpose. For Japan, the change was unsettling. Reports described increasingly aggressive and unpredictable P-38 tactics. Zeros were no longer guaranteed a turn-based advantage. Japanese commanders noted that American pilots were no longer reactive, they dictated engagements. Beyond tactical engagements, the P-38's transformation influenced broader strategy. High-altitude reconnaissance and long-range strikes became feasible. Bombers reached targets deeper in Japanese-held territory with effective escort cover. The psychological effect on Japanese air forces was profound. Their once untouchable Zeros now faced a fighter that could survive, strike, and dominate. The wire fix and other mechanical adaptations, while simple in concept, demonstrated the power of rapid field innovation. Engineers back in the U.S. accelerated these improvements into production models. Factory-built P-38s now incorporated reinforced tail assemblies, improved ailerons, and upgraded elevator controls, standardizing what had begun as improvisation. Every squadron in the Solomons, New Guinea, and later the Philippines began seeing these effects. The Lightning's victories became predictable, systematic, and devastating. Where earlier in the war Zeros had dictated engagement, P-38s now determined the outcome. The war in the sky was no longer just a contest of machines. It had become a contest of adaptation, ingenuity, and human determination. The second part of the aftermath will examine long-term consequences, numbers, and psychological impact on both sides, connecting these shifts to the broader Pacific campaign. By early 1944, the P-38 Lightning had firmly established itself as a cornerstone of U.S. air power in the Pacific. Loss ratios reflected this dominance. Squadrons reported kill-to-loss ratios exceeding 5:1 in certain engagements. While the Zero remained nimble, its light construction and minimal armor made it increasingly vulnerable to concentrated fire. Japanese pilots, once confident in their dogfighting superiority, now approached encounters with caution, fear, and at times, outright avoidance. The psychological shift was as decisive as the mechanical one. U.S. pilots, once acutely aware of their vulnerability, now flew with confidence. Letters and diaries from this period capture a striking transformation. Airmen no longer viewed the Zero with awe or terror. They approached missions knowing they could survive, strike, and retreat on their own terms. On the Japanese side, morale faltered. Reports from commanding officers noted a growing perception of P-38 invincibility. The Lightning dictates every engagement, one report stated. Veteran Zeros, who had once turned the skis into a playground of agility, faced a predator capable of attacking at speed, disengaging at will, and surviving punishment that would have grounded their own aircraft. This perception forced shifts in Japanese tactics, more conservative formations, avoidance of altitude battles, and a growing reliance on numerical superiority rather than maneuvering skill. Strategically, the P-38's dominance reshaped campaigns. Escorting bombers over the vast Pacific became less perilous. Reconnaissance flights reached deeper into enemy territory with higher success rates. Strike missions could disrupt Japanese supply lines with reduced losses. The aircraft's range and survivability meant that previously unreachable targets were now within operational reach, altering the operational map in favor of the Allies. Beyond the numbers, the Lightning story illustrated a critical lesson. Rapid adaptation and field innovation could outweigh initial technical inferiority. A simple mechanical adjustment, a tightened wire or modified control rod, amplified pilot effectiveness, changed tactical doctrine, and ultimately shifted strategic balance. By mid-1944, U.S. squadrons flying the P-38 were not merely surviving against the Zero, they were defining the terms of aerial engagement. What had begun as improvisation on a jungle airstrip became a standardized advantage, demonstrating the profound intersection of ingenuity, courage, and technology. The stage was now set for reflection, a calm historical examination of what the Lightning's transformation meant for pilots, engineers, the Pacific Campaign, and the broader lessons of warfare. War is often measured in numbers, planes lost, bombs dropped, miles gained. But the story of the P-38 Lightning teaches something subtler, that human ingenuity, even in its smallest form, can reshape the course of events. A single wire, a handful of mechanics, and pilots willing to trust their aircraft transformed a machine once mocked into a predator that dictated the skies. The Pacific Theater, with its vast distances and unforgiving conditions, demanded more than courage. It demanded adaptation. The P-38's evolution from cumbersome to lethal demonstrates that technology alone does not win wars. The combination of human observation, rapid innovation, and tactical application does. A craft designed for range and firepower became agile and precise, not through redesign in a distant factory, but through the ingenuity of those who confronted its weaknesses directly. For the pilots, the transformation meant survival and mastery. Every dive, every climb, every burst of concentrated fire carried the confidence born from understanding and trust. Fear gave way to calculated aggression. For the Japanese, it was a lesson in underestimating the adaptive spirit. The Lightning became a symbol of how quickly advantage can shift when innovation meets necessity. Beyond military strategy, this story resonates with a broader truth. Progress often emerges where resourcefulness confronts limitation. Small interventions can ripple outward, changing outcomes in ways neither side anticipates. In the end, the P-38 Lightning reminds us that wars are won not only by numbers or initial superiority, but by the courage to experiment, to refine, and to master both machine and circumstance. The sky above the Solomon Islands, once a proving ground for fear and frustration, became a testament to ingenuity. And in that space, where human skill met mechanical possibility, the P-38 Lightning earned its place, no longer laughed at, but respected, feared, and remembered.